The day Tobias Turner signed half his land over to a woman who had not yet agreed to marry him was the day the whole town of Redrock Flats decided he had finally lost his mind, and the day Ellen Keating decided, quietly and without telling a single soul, that he might be the only sane man she had ever met. It was the spring of 1882, and the territory of New Mexico was still wild in all the ways that mattered. The mountains in the distance held snow through April, and the flatlands between Redrock Flats and the Cimarron River were dry and red and gorgeous in a way that made a person feel both small and chosen at the same time. The town itself was a modest thing, just two main streets that crossed each other at right angles, a general store, a telegraph office, a saloon called the Dusty Boot that smelled of cedar and old whiskey, a church that leaned slightly to the east, and a land registry office run by a sharp-eyed man named Harold Fitch who wore the same brown vest every single day of his known life. Ellen Keating had arrived in Redrock Flats 11 months before the spring of 1882, which put her arrival squarely in June of 1881. She had come from San Antonio, which was not a small town and not a quiet life, but the life she had been living there had become untenable in ways she was not always comfortable explaining. Her father, Desmond Keating, had been a decent man who made poor decisions with money and died, owing significant debts to men who were not decent at all. Her mother, Clara, had passed 2 years before Desmond, taken by a fever that swept through the lower quarters of San Antonio in the summer of 1879. Ellen had one younger brother, Patrick, who was 17 and living with their aunt outside of Austin, and he was the reason she had not simply stayed and fought the creditors with whatever pride she had left. She had left San Antonio with $42, a carpetbag of clothes, a small leather satchel that contained her mother's Bible and 3 daguerreotypes she could not bring herself to part with, and a letter of introduction to a woman named Mrs. Agatha Hollies who ran the boarding house in Redrock Flats. Mrs. Hollies had been a friend of Ellen's mother from before the war, and she had written to Ellen upon hearing of Desmond's death, offering a room and steady work helping to manage the boarding house in exchange for a small wage. It was not a glamorous arrangement, but it was honest, and Ellen Keating had decided somewhere on the long stage ride north through the dusty scrub country that honesty was the thing she was most interested in from that point forward. She was 24 years old when she arrived, with dark auburn hair that she kept in a practical braid most mornings and loose over her shoulders on Sundays, green eyes that people tended to notice, and a way of carrying herself that suggested she had been through something but was not defeated by it. She was not the kind of woman who sought pity, and she was not the kind who sought attention, but she had a directness about her that made conversations with her memorable. Men in Redrock Flats noticed her immediately, the way men noticed any unmarried woman in a town where unmarried women were not common, but Ellen was selective with her smiles and even more selective with her time, and after a few polite but firm rejections, most of the eligible men in town had redirected their attentions elsewhere. Tobias Turner had not, strictly speaking, directed his attention toward her in the way those other men had. He had not brought her wildflowers or lingered outside the boarding house hoping she would appear on the porch. He was not that kind of man. Tobias was 31 years old, broad-shouldered and lean in the way that a man gets when he has been doing physical work his entire adult life. He had light brown hair that went sun-bleached at the front and dark brown eyes that were quiet and thoughtful in a way that could be mistaken for sullenness, until you caught one of his rare smiles, which were genuine enough to make you feel like you had been given something real. He had a straight nose that had been broken once, a jaw that was almost stubbornly square, and hands that were rough from work but precise in the way they moved. He had come to Redrock Flats 4 years before Ellen, in 1877, having worked his way west from Tennessee after the death of his father. He had started with nothing but his own labor and a stubbornness that bordered on theological, and he had spent 3 years working other men's cattle and saving with the discipline of a monk, until he had enough to purchase a parcel of land 6 miles east of town along a tributary of the Cimarron. The land was not glamorous. It was not the greenest parcel in the territory, and nobody had been fighting over it when he bought it. But it sat at an elevation that gave it better water access than the flatlands. It had a natural shelter break of cottonwood and piñon on the northern edge, and Tobias had looked at it the way a man looks at a thing that other people have overlooked and seen exactly what it could become. By the spring of 1882, the Turner place, as it had come to be known, was 640 acres of functional cattle operation. He ran about 80 head, had a solid 2-room cabin that he had expanded into a proper 4-room house the previous winter, a barn that was better built than most of the structures in town, 2 good horses named Franklin and Cass, and a working relationship with a Mexican hand named Rodrigo Vega, who came by 3 days a week and was the most reliable person Tobias had ever employed. The land had a deed that was clean and uncontested, registered in proper order with Harold Fitch at the land office, and Tobias Turner owned every inch of it outright. He was, by any reasonable measure, the most eligible bachelor in Redrock Flats. He was also, by general consensus, the most oblivious about it. The first time Ellen and Tobias had a real conversation was in October of 1881, at the harvest social that the church organized every year in the clearing behind the Hollies boarding house. Mrs. Hollies ran the social largely because she liked to be at the center of things, and she was good at organizing, and the church was grateful for her energy. Ellen helped set up tables and arrange the food, and generally kept everything moving, and she was in the middle of trying to wrestle a particularly stubborn folding table into a level position when Tobias Turner appeared at her elbow, took hold of the opposite end of the table, and simply leveled it without being asked. "The left leg is bent," he said, examining it. "Hold on." He took a small tool from his belt, which was the kind of thing a man kept on him when he spent most of his days fixing things, and he straightened the leg with 3 efficient movements and the table stood level. "Thank you," Ellen said. "I've been fighting that thing for 10 minutes. "It's the one with the bent leg," he said, as though this explained everything. "Everybody at the social always ends up fighting it. Nobody's ever fixed it." She looked at him. Why hasn't anyone fixed it before tonight? He considered this for a moment with the seriousness of a man thinking about something genuinely interesting. "I suppose nobody thought it was their problem to fix," he said, "but it keeps being a problem. So you decided to fix it. Seemed like the sensible thing," he said, and then he touched the brim of his hat and walked away to get a cup of apple cider, leaving her standing beside a perfectly level table feeling like something had just happened that she could not quite name. She asked Mrs. Hollies about him afterward, in the way that a person asks about something that is nagging at the back of their mind. Mrs. Hollies told her about the Turner place and about how Tobias had built it up from nothing and about how he was a good man and a serious man, and a man who was not given to idle talk or foolishness, which was a rarer combination than it sounded. Ellen nodded and went to bed and thought about the table leg and the way he had said sensible, and she found that she was smiling without having made a conscious decision to do so. After that, she noticed him. Not in an obvious way, because Ellen was not an obvious person, but in the way that you begin to notice the particular quality of light in the late afternoon once someone has pointed out how beautiful it is. She noticed him at the general store on the first Friday of every month, when he came in to pick up supplies. She noticed him at church on Sundays, where he sat 3 rows from the back on the right side and listened to Reverend Marsh with the attentive gravity of a man who was actually thinking about what was being said rather than waiting for it to end. She noticed him at the Dusty Boot on occasional Saturday evenings, where he would have exactly 1 whiskey and play 2 games of cards and leave at a reasonable hour, and he never got loud and never started trouble, and never seemed to be performing anything for anyone. They exchanged pleasantries when they encountered each other. He was always courteous. She was always warm but not excessive about it. It stayed in the register of two people who knew each other by name in a small town and nothing more. And then came the cold February of 1882, and with it, the trouble that changed everything. The trouble arrived in the form of a man named Clarence Holt, which was a name that people in Redrock Flats had mixed feelings about. Clarence Holt was 43, and he had money from land speculation and cattle brokering, and he used both of those things the way a man uses a weapon, which is to say with intention and without sentiment. He was not physically imposing, being rather short and thin with pale eyes and a carefully trimmed mustache, but he had a way of making the air in a room feel tighter when he entered it, and most people in Redrock Flats had learned to manage their dealings with him carefully. The trouble for Ellen specifically was that Clarence Holt had decided he wanted the boarding house. He had made this known to Mrs. Hollis in December of 1881, when he had arrived at the boarding house with a contract that he described as generous and expected her to sign it before she had finished reading it. Mrs. Hollis, who had not survived 56 years in frontier territory without developing a spine made of something considerably stronger than bone, had told him she would do no such thing, and that he could take his contract and his expectations back out the door he came in through. Clarence Holt did not take well to being told no by women. He left, but he did not stop. In January, he had stopped paying the taxes on a property adjacent to the boarding house, which he owned, and then claimed that Mrs. Hollis had been using a portion of that land for her kitchen garden, which was partially true in a boundary sense that had never been officially contested, and he filed a complaint with the county land office in Las Vegas, which was the nearest county seat and a full day's ride away. The matter was not resolved by February, and while it was unresolved, it hung over the boarding house like weather. Mrs. Hollis was not well in February. She had developed a cough in January that had settled into her chest and would not leave, and the stress of the legal dispute was not helping her recover. She was still running the boarding house and still managing things, but there were days when she barely left her room, and on those days, Ellen ran everything. It was on one of those days, a gray Tuesday in the second week of February, that Clarence Holt came to the boarding house while Mrs. Hollis was in bed and found Ellen at the front desk doing the accounts. He sat down across from her without being invited, which told her everything she needed to know about how the conversation was going to go, and he told her in a very pleasant voice that Mrs. Hollis was going to lose the boundary dispute, and that the legal fees alone might make the boarding house difficult to maintain, and that he was prepared to offer a very fair price for the whole property if they wanted to avoid the prolonged unpleasantness. Ellen looked at him across the desk with the kind of calm that was not the absence of feeling but the management of it, and she said, "Mrs. Hollis is not interested in selling, Mr. Holt. I think you already know that." Holt smiled and said, "Miss Keating, I think you are a sensible woman, sensible enough to understand that what I'm offering is better than what's coming if this goes before the county judge." She held his gaze without flinching and said, "Then I suppose we'll see what the county judge says," and she did not add anything else because she did not need to. He left, but he left the way Clarence Holt always left, which was with the slow satisfaction of a man who believes the outcome is already determined and is willing to wait for it. That evening, after the supper dishes were done and the two current boarders were in their rooms, Ellen sat at the kitchen table and allowed herself 15 minutes of genuine worry. The boundary dispute was real, and legal fees were real, and Mrs. Hollis's health was fragile, and the boarding house was not a wealthy enterprise. She thought about Patrick in Austin, and about the $42 she had arrived with, of which 37 remained because she had been careful, and she thought about the way things had a habit of going badly in a series rather than one at a time. Then she closed the accounts book, washed her face, and went to bed, because worrying past 15 minutes had never solved anything in her experience, and she needed to be useful tomorrow. The next morning she ran into Tobias Turner at the general store, which was not unusual, but something in her face must have been slightly different from its normal arrangement, because he stopped alongside her at the counter where she was waiting for Mr. Aldridge to pack her order, and he said, without any particular preamble, "Are you all right?" She looked at him. He was looking at her with those quiet dark eyes in a direct way that was not intrusive but was genuinely attentive, and she said, "There's some business with Mrs. Holly's and a property dispute," and she said it because she had not meant to say anything at all. He nodded slowly. "I heard something about that. Holt." "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Has she got a lawyer?" "There's Mr. Cruz in town, but the county judge is in Las Vegas, and traveling there is not easy for her right now. She's not well." He thought about this. "Does she know exactly where the boundary line is? Has she got a survey?" Ellen looked at him with something that was almost sharp. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't think the boundary was ever formally surveyed between the two properties. That's part of the problem. A formal survey would establish it," he said. "If the boundary has been used without contest for long enough, there may be a prescriptive right. Cruz would know." He said this not in the manner of a man showing off what he knew, but in the manner of a man who had had to learn about land surveys and property rights out of genuine necessity, and was sharing information that seemed relevant. He had spent 4 years making sure his own land was properly documented, and he knew what a clean deed meant and what a contested boundary could cost. "I'll talk to Mrs. Holly's," Ellen said, and Mr. Aldridge arrived with her order, and the conversation naturally concluded. But she did talk to Mrs. Holly's that afternoon, and Mrs. Holly's pulled out a document box from under her bed that contained, among other things, a partial survey from 1874 that showed the property line in a way that did not entirely support Clarence Holt's claim. Ellen took the document to Mr. Cruz the next morning, and Mr. Cruz, who was a decent lawyer if not a spectacular one, confirmed that the survey combined with 20 years of uncontested use created a legal position that was worth defending, and that he would write to the county judge's office on Mrs. Holly's behalf. It did not solve everything, but it was a beginning, and it had started because of a conversation in the general store. Ellen thought about this. She thought about the harvest social and the table leg and the sensible thing. She thought about the way Tobias Turner moved through the world with this quiet purposefulness that was not flashy and not loud, but was entirely present. And she found herself wanting to have another conversation with him in a way that felt distinctly different from how she felt about conversations in general. She was 24 years old, and she had decided after San Antonio that she was not going to be careless with her heart, and she still believed that. But she was also honest enough with herself to recognize the particular quality of interest she had developed in Tobias Turner, and she was practical enough to know that ignoring it would not make it go away. March came in with wind and cold nights and days that were bright and clear in a way that made the red land look like it was lit from underneath. Tobias came into town on his regular supply Friday and found Ellen on the porch of the boarding house, repairing a section of the railing that had come loose over the winter. She was doing it competently with a hammer and proper nails, and she did not look like a woman who expected anyone to take over, but he stopped at the gate and said, "That bottom rail is going to split if you drive the nail that far to the left." She looked at the nail. She looked at him. "You're right," she said, and moved the nail to where it ought to go. He came through the gate and crouched down to look at the rail below, which was the one doing most of the structural work, and he said, "This one needs replacing, not just nailing. You've got rot in the wood." "I noticed that," she said. "I'm going to ask Mr. Aldridge if he has a piece of cedar the right width." "I've got some cut cedar at the place that's the right size," he said. He said it without any particular significance, just as a fact. "I can bring it by tomorrow if you want. Save you the cost." She sat back on her heels and looked at him squarely. "Why would you do that?" He met her gaze, and there was something in his face that was not quite comfortable but was absolutely honest. "Because the railing needs it," he said, "and I have the wood." She was quiet for a moment. "Tobias," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name, and she noted that it felt natural in her mouth. "I would appreciate that very much." He brought the cedar the next day, and he replaced the bottom rail himself while she held the brackets, and they talked the entire time he worked. Not about anything particular at first, but conversations in small spaces have a way of going deeper than conversations in large ones, and somewhere between the first nail and the last, they had talked about San Antonio and Tennessee, and about what it meant to build something in a place where the land itself was still being decided, and about what it felt like to be an honest person in a territory where honesty was not always rewarded. He told her about the day he had bought the Turner place, how he had stood on the high eastern edge of it in the early morning, with the mountains to the west and the flat country rolling away to the south, and felt something settle in his chest that had never fully settled before, a sense that he was in the right place doing the right thing. He said it quietly and without drama, and she listened to him say it, and felt something shift in the region of her own chest that she did not examine too closely in the moment, but returned to many times later. She told him about her mother and about Patrick and about the $42 and the carpetbag, and he listened with the same attentiveness he brought to everything else. And when she finished, he said, "That's a brave thing to start over like that." And he said it without condescension or pity, just as a plain truth, and she found it was one of the kindest things anyone had said to her in recent memory. After the railing was done, he stayed for coffee, which Mrs. Hollis, who was feeling marginally better that day, served herself with the knowing look of a woman who has been reading people for 56 years and knows what she is seeing. Ellen pointedly did not look at Mrs. Hollis. Tobias was too genuinely absorbed in the coffee to notice anything. He came by the boarding house again the following week to check on the railing, which was not necessary, but which Ellen found entirely acceptable as reasons for visiting went. They walked down the main street together for a short while, talking about the spring conditions and the cattle market and a book she had been reading, which was a copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch that she had ordered through the general store 6 months ago and which had finally arrived. He had not read it, but he asked her about it with real interest, and she described it to him in a way that made him say, "I should order a copy," and she believed that he meant it. By the end of March, they had reached an understanding that was not spoken but was thoroughly understood by both of them and by every person in Redrock Flats who had eyes and the ability to observe. Mrs. Holly said nothing directly but smiled to herself with great frequency. Harold Fitch at the land office remarked to his wife that Turner was coming into town a lot more than he used to. The Reverend Marsh noted that Miss Keating and Mr. Turner seemed to be engaged in conversation on a considerable number of Sunday afternoons. Rodrigo Vega, when Tobias came back from town with a slightly lighter expression than usual, said nothing at all but was satisfied in a deep and uncomplicated way. The trouble with Clarence Holt took a turn in early April that was more serious than expected. Mr. Cruz had sent his letter to the county judge's office, and the judge, a man named Howard Prescott, had agreed to review the boundary matter, but Clarence Holt had in the meantime hired a lawyer from Santa Fe who was considerably more capable than Mr. Cruz, and this lawyer had filed a counterclaim that was aggressive and technical and expensive to fight. Cruz came to the boarding house on a Thursday morning with papers in hand and a look on his face that conveyed the situation before he said a word. The counterclaim argued not only that the boundary favored Holt, but that Mrs. Hollis's property title had an irregularity from 1873, when the original deed had changed hands. An irregularity that was possibly significant and possibly not, but was certainly going to cost money to resolve. To contest it properly, Cruz estimated the legal costs at somewhere between $40 and $60, which was a sum that Mrs. Holly's technically had, but which would require drawing down the reserve she kept for emergencies and repairs. And at 66 years old, with a chest that was still not clear and a boarding house that required constant upkeep, Mrs. Holly's reserve was not a thing to be spent carelessly. Ellen was sitting at the kitchen table when Cruz left, running the numbers in her head and not liking what they added up to. She had her $37. She could contribute that, and it would bring the reserve down less, but it would leave her with nothing, and she had Patrick to think about. Patrick, who would be 18 in the fall and who needed to come west eventually because Texas with their aunt was not a permanent solution. She sat with the weight of it and breathed steadily and did not make herself miserable about it because that never helped either. It was that same afternoon that Tobias came by the boarding house, not on his usual supply day, which was a deviation from his established pattern that Mrs. Holly's noticed and which Ellen also noticed. He had ridden in specifically, and when he asked for Ellen rather than for Mrs. Holly's made herself entirely scarce in the way of a woman who knows when to be elsewhere. They sat on the porch in the good afternoon light, and he asked her directly how the business with Holt was going, and she told him, with the plain honesty that was the only currency she traded in, exactly what Cruz had said about the costs and the counterclaim. She did not ask him for anything, and she was not performing helplessness, because she had never performed that in her life, and she ended by saying, "I'm trying to work out what the best path forward looks like, because Mrs. Holly's built that boarding house herself after her husband died, and I will not let Clarence Holt take it from her if there is any way to stop it." Tobias listened to all of this with his hands resting on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment in the way that she had come to understand meant he was thinking seriously about something rather than thinking about what to say next. He looked at her, and there was something in his expression that was more open than she had ever seen it, something that was both careful and very sure at the same time. "I know a land attorney in Santa Fe," he said. "Better than Cruz and better than Holt's man, I'd wager. His name is Daniel Fremont, and he handled a boundary matter for a rancher up near Cimarron 2 years back that Holt was involved in, and he won it. He knows Holt's methods." Ellen looked at him steadily. "That kind of attorney costs more than the one in Santa Fe that Holt hired." "Yes," Tobias said. "Probably." She held his gaze. "Tobias, I'm not offering to pay for Mrs. Holly's legal fight," he said. "I wouldn't do that without her asking, and I wouldn't offer it to you like that either." He paused. "What I'm saying is that I know the man, and I can write to him and ask him to consider the case. Sometimes the right lawyer will take on something for less than his usual rate when the circumstances are clear-cut, and the opposition is someone he has reason to want to beat." Ellen was quiet for a moment. "And you think these circumstances are clear-cut?" "I think Holt is doing what Holt always does," Tobias said. "He finds a technical crack and he drives a wedge into it, and he uses the cost of fighting to wear people down. I think the underlying title to Mrs. Holly's property is sound, and I think a good lawyer would see it." She looked at him in the golden afternoon light and felt something she recognized and did not try to talk herself out of. "Thank you," she said. "If you would write to Mr. Fremont, that would help." He wrote the letter that evening, and he brought it to the telegraph office the next morning, and he paid for it to go out that same day, which was a cost he absorbed without mentioning it, and which Ellen learned about from the telegraph operator's wife 6 days later, and which she turned over in her mind for a long time afterward. Daniel Fremont replied within a week, and his reply was yes, and his terms were considerably more manageable than anyone had expected. And he arrived in Redrock Flats on a Tuesday in late April with a leather case full of documents and the deliberate air of a man who had not lost a land case in 4 years. He spent 2 days reviewing Mrs. Holly's documents and 1 day interviewing neighboring property owners who had been there in 1873 and could attest to the original boundary, And then he wrote a response to the counterclaim that was so precise and so thorough that Mr. Cruz read it and said, with genuine admiration, "I wish I could write like this man." The counterclaim collapsed within 3 weeks. Clarence Holt withdrew it through his Santa Fe lawyer with the particular silence of a man who has decided the battle is not worth the cost, which was a silence that Mrs. Hollis received with great dignity and Ellen received with profound relief. The boundary was confirmed as it had always been. Mrs. Hollis's title was clean. The kitchen garden stayed where it had always been. When Ellen told Tobias, standing outside the general store on a bright May morning with the smell of sage on the air and the distant mountains still showing white at the peaks, she was smiling in a way she rarely allowed herself to smile in public, fully and without restraint. And he looked at her smiling like that and something in his face changed in a way that was visible and permanent. "I'm glad," he said, and it was simple and he meant it completely. She looked at him for a moment and then said, "Come to supper on Friday, Mrs. Hollis wants to thank you properly. She made me promise to invite you." He came on Friday, and Mrs. Hollis made a proper meal with roasted chicken and cornbread and apple pie, and she thanked him in the direct and genuine way that was her particular grace, and then she excused herself early on a pretense that would not have fooled a child, leaving Tobias and Ellen at the kitchen table with the remnants of apple pie and 2 cups of coffee, and neither of them was particularly in a hurry to leave. They sat at that table for 2 hours. The conversation went from the land case to the spring cattle market to Tennessee to San Antonio to books, and then, at some point between the second cup of coffee and the last of the pie, it became something else. It became the kind of conversation that is really just 2 people telling each other who they are, the actual private version, not the version they show in church or at the general store, and both of them were old enough to recognize what that kind of conversation meant. When he stood to leave, late in the evening with the stars clear and cold outside the window, he paused at the kitchen door and said, "Ellen," in a way that put a particular weight on her name that it had not carried before, and she turned to look at him and he said, "I would like to call on you properly, if that would be all right." She looked at him for a moment in the lamplight and said, "Yes, Tobias, that would be all right." He called on her properly. He came by 2 evenings a week, on Tuesday and Friday, and on Sundays after church they walked together. And on the first Sunday in June they walked all the way out to the eastern edge of town, where the land opened up toward the Cimarron tributary and you could see the mountains and the red plain and the wide sky all at once, and he pointed toward the hills to the east and said, "The Turner place is 6 miles that way. You can just see the cottonwoods on a clear day." She shaded her eyes and looked. She could see a dark line against the red earth that might have been cottonwoods. "You built all of it yourself?" she asked. "Rodrigo helped with the barn," he said. "And a man named Oakes who passed through in the winter of '79 helped me frame the house extension, but mostly yes." She looked at the distant trees for a long moment. "I'd like to see it," she said. "The place." He looked at her with the same quality of expression that she was beginning to catalog and understand, that open and careful and very sure thing that lived in his face when he was not guarding it. "I'll take you out on Saturday," he said, "if Mrs. Hollis will come along." Mrs. Hollis came along on Saturday, and she rode in the wagon with great composure while Tobias drove and Ellen sat beside him on the bench with the wind moving her loose hair and the sun on the red land making everything glow at the edges. Mrs. Hollis sat in the wagon bed and very carefully looked at the scenery in all directions except forward. The Turner place was, as Ellen had understood it would be, exactly what Tobias had described. It was not grand, but it was solid and considered, and everything about it had been thought through. The house was built of adobe and timber with a proper stone foundation, and a porch on the south side that caught the afternoon light, and there were window boxes that had clearly been added recently and were currently empty, but showed the intention of someone who had thought about how the place might look if it were tended. The barn was indeed better than most structures in town. The cottonwoods on the northern edge stood tall and moved in the breeze with a sound like water, and the land to the south fell away in a gentle grade toward the tributary where willows grew thick and pale green in the early summer. Ellen walked the whole property while Tobias talked her through it, where the fence lines ran and where the cattle grazed in summer, and where the creek ran lowest in August, and how he managed it through the dry months. He talked about it the way a person talks about something they have built with their own hands and their own care, not with boastfulness but with the quiet pride of a craftsman. And she listened to him talk about it, and thought about the land spreading away in all directions and the sky above it and the life that could be made in a place like this. She did not say any of that, but she thought it, and the thought stayed with her on the drive back to town, and through the week that followed, settling deeper and becoming more specific as the days passed. In the third week of June, a thing happened that neither Ellen nor Tobias had planned, and which was the kind of thing that announces itself with the sudden simplicity of something that has been true for a long time already. They were walking back from Sunday church through the main street of Redrock Flats, and a thunderstorm came up fast from the west, the way summer storms did in New Mexico, dropping from a clear sky to a wall of black cloud in what felt like minutes. Tobias pulled her quickly under the overhang of the general store, and they stood there together as the rain came down hard and fast, the street going from dust to mud in seconds, and the sound of it on the overhang was loud enough that you had to stand close to hear anything. She was standing very close to him, not inappropriately, just practically, the way you stand when the rain is coming in sideways and the overhang is not wide. She could feel the warmth of him beside her and smell the clean outdoor smell of him, soap and cedar and horses, and she was aware of every inch of the distance between them in a way that was entirely new. He looked down at her and she looked up at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched longer than moments usually do. "Ellen," he said. "Yes," she said, and she was not answering a question he had asked yet. He took her hand, which was the first time he had ever done that, and he held it with the same care and precision with which he held everything, and they stood there in the rain under the general store overhang while the summer storm moved through Redrock Flats, and the whole world was the sound of rain and his hand around hers. It was the most romantic thing that had ever happened to her, and it was a man holding her hand on a dusty street in a rainstorm in a small New Mexico Territory town, and she did not require it to be anything grander than it was because it was enough. After that, the calling on her twice a week took on a different texture. There was less discussion of general things and more discussion of real things, specific things, particular things. He asked about Patrick and about when she thought her brother might come west. She told him about the letters she had been writing, trying to arrange for Patrick to travel to Redrock Flats in the fall when he turned 18, and about her worry that 18 was still young, and the country between Austin and New Mexico was not always kind. Tobias listened and said he would be glad to ride down to the first stage station and meet the boy when he came, so he did not make the last leg of the journey alone, and Ellen had to look away for a moment because the generosity of it was sudden and she was not prepared. She asked him about Tennessee, about what he had left behind, and he told her about his father who had been a good man but a stubborn one, and about the older brother who had stayed to run the family farm and who wrote occasional letters that were brief and informative and careful in the way that letters between brothers who love each other but were raised to be spare with their feelings tend to be. He told her that he missed the green of Tennessee sometimes, the particular soft, wet green of it, and that the dry, red beauty of New Mexico was a different kind of thing that he had come to love, but loving it did not mean the other thing was forgotten. She thought he was telling her something about grief and beauty existing together, and she thought it was one of the truest things she had heard a man say. July came in hot and dry and magnificent, and in the first week of July, Tobias rode out with Ellen and Mrs. Hollies again to the Turner place because the cottonwoods were in full leaf, and the tributary was running low and clear, and he wanted to show her something at the high eastern edge of the property that he had not shown her the first time. They rode to the edge in the late afternoon, and the view from there was the whole world spread out in light and distance, the mountains to the west going purple in the late sun, the land below them red and gold and green where the willows grew, and the sky above it all enormous and clean and shot through with the kind of light that only existed in the high desert in summer. She stood at the edge with the wind moving her hair and thought, "This is my country." She had not thought that before about any place, not even San Antonio, and the thinking of it now felt like something settled permanently into the right position. Tobias was standing a few feet away, looking at the same view, and she looked at his profile against the light and thought about all of it, the table leg and the cedar rail and the letter to Daniel Fremont and the hand in the rain. And she thought, this is a man who fixes things not because he expects something in return, but because things need fixing, and who gives not because he is performing generosity, but because he genuinely cannot be otherwise. And she thought, I am in love with this man. And the thought was so clear and so simple and so completely obvious that she almost laughed. She did not laugh, but she was smiling when he turned to look at her, and he looked at her smiling and looked at her for a long moment, and then looked back at the view with something that was close to happiness moving across his face. August brought more heat and the dry weight of the late summer, and Tobias began coming to the boarding house 3 evenings a week instead of 2, which nobody commented on and everybody noticed. On a Tuesday evening in mid-August, they were sitting on the porch in the cooler air of the early evening, and he was telling her about a problem with the eastern fence line that the summer's dry heat had contracted the wood of and which he and Rodrigo were working on, and she was listening and thinking about the fence line and the property, and she said, with the directness that was her particular nature, "What do you want, Tobias? For the future? For the place?" He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I want more cattle in the next few years. I think the land can support it with a good water plan. I want to add to the north pasture." He paused. "And I want a family." He said the last part looking at her, and she looked back at him in the early evening light. "That is not a small thing to want," she said. "No," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going to pretend I don't understand what you're saying, Tobias, because we both know I understand it very clearly." "I know you do," he said, "and I'm not trying to rush anything. I just don't see any point in talking around what I mean." She looked at her hands in her lap and then back at him. "I care about you," she said, "very much, in a way that is not what I feel about other people here. I think you know that." "Yes," he said. "I want to be honest with you about what I carry," she said. "Patrick, the responsibility of him. He's coming in October and he needs to get on his feet, and I won't put that down, not for any reason." "I wouldn't ask you to," he said, with a simplicity and completeness that made the statement utterly believable. "I know," she said. She looked at him. "Give me until Patrick arrives and is settled. That's what I'm asking." He nodded once, and there was nothing in his expression that looked disappointed or impatient, only that quiet certainty that she had come to rely on like a landmark. "All right," he said. Patrick Keating arrived in the first week of October, on a Wednesday, coming in on the afternoon stage from Albuquerque where he had changed coaches. And he was indeed 18, and indeed young-looking for it, with his sister's auburn hair and their mother's way of being slightly wide-eyed about everything than was strictly practical. He was also, Ellen discovered within approximately 20 minutes, a fundamentally good-natured and adaptable person who was excited about New Mexico and enthusiastic about learning to work cattle, which were both useful qualities in his current situation. Tobias rode to the stage station to meet him, as he had said he would, and he brought the boy back to town on a borrowed horse with the same steady courtesy he brought to everything. And Patrick took one look at Tobias Turner and one look at his sister looking at Tobias Turner, and arrived at a correct conclusion without anyone having to explain anything. Over the following weeks, Tobias arranged for Patrick to work with Rodrigo Vega at the Turner place 3 days a week, learning the basics of cattle work and fence maintenance and water management, which was practical and useful, and gave Patrick a reason to get up in the morning, and a skill set he would need in this country. Patrick took to it with genuine enthusiasm, and Rodrigo, who had strong opinions about work ethic, declared the boy acceptable within a week, which was the closest thing to high praise that Rodrigo offered to anyone. Ellen watched all of this and felt something that was very close to the specific happiness of having the two parts of your life fitting together cleanly, and she sat with that feeling and examined it honestly and found it to be real and sound. On a Saturday morning in the second week of October, not quite 2 weeks after Patrick had arrived and settled, Harold Fitch came to the boarding house before 9 o'clock in the morning, with an expression on his face that was a remarkable combination of professional neutrality and barely contained astonishment, and he asked to speak with Mrs. Hollies, and when Mrs. Hollies came to the front desk with Ellen beside her, Harold Fitch produced a document and said, in a voice that was admirably controlled, that Tobias Turner had come to the land office the previous afternoon and had executed a legal transfer of half his property, specifically the eastern 250 acres including the high eastern ridge and the section of the Cottonwood Shelter Break, into the name of one Ellen Marie Keating. Mrs. Hollies made a sound that was between a gasp and a laugh. Ellen stood very still and looked at the document with the name Ellen Marie Keating in the formal legal language of a land transfer, and she said, "He did this already, before asking me." Harold Fitch cleared his throat and said, "He did. He said, and I am quoting Mr. Turner directly here, that he wanted her to have something of her own first, so that any yes she gave later was free." The silence that followed this statement was the particular silence of a thing being so right that it temporarily takes language away. Mrs. Hollies, who was not a woman given to visible sentimentality, was pressing her handkerchief to the corner of her eye with great dignity. Ellen looked at the document for a long moment. 250 acres, the eastern ridge, the cottonwoods, the view she had stood at in the July light and thought, "This is my country." He had given her the country before she agreed to share it with him. She handed the document back to Harold Fitch very carefully and said, "Where is he right now? Do you know?" Harold Fitch said he believed Mr. Turner was at the Aldridge store for his Friday supplies, which he had come into town a day late for because of some fence business yesterday, and Ellen was already putting on her coat. She walked to the general store with the particular stride of a woman who knows where she is going and why, and she found Tobias at the counter talking to Mr. Aldridge about grain prices, and she said, "Tobias," and he turned and she said, "Could we speak outside?" And he set down his grain tally and followed her out. They stood on the boardwalk in front of the general store in the October morning light, and she looked at him with everything she felt visible in her face because she had decided somewhere between the boarding house and the store that there was no point being anything other than transparent about this. "You signed half your land over to me," she said. "Yes," he said, "before asking me anything." "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. "Why?" He held her gaze and said, with the same plain honesty that had been the defining quality of him from the first conversation at the Harvest Social, "Because I didn't want you to say yes to me out of practicality or necessity. Because you came here with nothing and built something honest, and you deserve to have something that's yours regardless of what you decide about me. Because the land is the best thing I have, and giving you part of it before asking for anything means I'm not trading it for your answer." She was quiet for a moment. A wagon went past on the street, raising a little dust. Somewhere down the block, 2 dogs were having an opinion about something. "It is the most extraordinary thing anyone has ever done for me," she said. "And I want you to understand that I am going to say yes, Tobias, not because of the land, but because you are the person who would sign half his land over to a woman who hadn't agreed yet, and that tells me exactly who you are, and I have been in love with who you are for longer than I have been comfortable admitting." He looked at her, and the thing that moved across his face was not triumph or relief, but something much deeper and quieter, the expression of a man who has been careful with something precious and has just been told it was safe. "Ellen," he said. "Yes," she said. "To whatever question you haven't asked yet." Yes. He did ask, properly and fully, right there on the boardwalk of the main street of Redrock Flats on a Saturday morning in October, and she said yes again, and he took her hands in his the way he had taken her hand in the rain, with that same precise and careful hold, and several people on the street that morning witnessed the exchange, and the news was around the whole of Redrock Flats before lunch, which was as it should be. They were married in November, on a Saturday, in the church that leaned slightly east, with Reverend Marsh officiating and Mrs. Hollies in the front pew in her good blue dress, crying openly and without apology. Patrick stood up for his sister with a formality that exceeded his years and a pride that was entirely obvious, and Rodrigo Vega came in his best shirt and sat beside a woman he had been quietly courting for the past several months, a situation that nobody had known about but which Ellen, in retrospect, felt she should have seen coming, because Rodrigo was reliable in all things. 3 of the town's residents served as witnesses, including Harold Fitch, who brought his wife and wore a different vest for the occasion, which people remarked upon. Ellen wore a dress of deep green wool that Mrs. Hollies had helped her make over the previous weeks, and she had her hair up with a few pins that had been her mother's, and she carried a small bunch of dried late-season wildflowers, because fresh ones were not available in November, and she preferred something real to something forced. Tobias wore his good coat and a white shirt and looked like a man who was where he was supposed to be, and when Reverend Marsh asked him if he would take Ellen Keating as his wife, he said yes in a voice that was clear and complete, and did not require anything added to it. When they signed the marriage register, Harold Fitch, in his official capacity as land registry officer and witness, quietly processed the combined land document that made the Turner place a single 640-acre property in the names of Tobias and Ellen Turner, which was the appropriate legal conclusion to what had begun with that transfer document the previous month, and which Harold Fitch did with a satisfaction that was entirely professional and also entirely personal. They went home to the Turner place that evening, and Rodrigo had left a fire laid in the hearth, and a covered pot of something that smelled like a proper stew, and the window boxes that had been empty in June now had dried flower stems in them from the fall's last blooms, which was either Rodrigo's doing or a coincidence that nobody investigated too closely. The mountains were dark against the last light to the west, and the cottonwoods were bare and silver in the cold, and the house was warm and the stew was good, and the stars over the high desert were the kind that make you understand why people have always told stories about them. Ellen Turner stood on the south porch of the house that was now hers and Tobias's together, and looked at the land going away in the cold night, the eastern ridge that was hers in her own name, the silver of the willows far down the grade, the whole enormous sky, and she thought about the carpetbag and the $42 and the stage ride and the bent table leg, and she thought about how things unfold in ways that cannot be predicted and can only be trusted. Tobias came and stood behind her and put his arms around her, and she leaned back against him, and they stood there on the porch of their house in the November cold looking at their land, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed saying. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was cold and clear, and the kind of full that only exists when a life that has been incomplete finally has all its parts. Patrick settled into work at the Turner place with an energy that sometimes had to be redirected but was never doubted, and he proved to have a natural ease with horses that surprised everyone and which Tobias recognized and cultivated deliberately, giving him more responsibility with the horses as the months went on. Patrick wrote to their aunt in Texas that he was doing well and that Redrock Flats was a fine place, and that his sister had married a good man and the land was extraordinary, and the aunt wrote back that she was relieved to hear it and that she had always known Ellen would find her way. In February of 1883, a letter arrived from Tennessee. It was from Tobias's brother, whose name was Samuel, and who wrote in the brief and informative and careful way that Tobias had described. But the letter was longer than usual, and at the end of it Samuel said that he was glad Tobias had found a wife and asked if they might one day come east, or alternatively, whether there was country worth settling in New Mexico, because Samuel's oldest boy was 16 and was the kind of boy who needed more country than Tennessee had left to give him. Tobias read the letter twice and handed it to Ellen, and Ellen read it and said, "Tell him there is plenty of country." And she said it with the authority of someone who owns 250 acres of it in her own name. Tobias wrote back to Samuel with an account of the land and the territory and the cattle operation, and an open invitation that was not performance but genuine extension, the kind of invitation that means there is actually room. Samuel wrote back that he would think seriously on it. Spring came to Redrock Flats and to the Turner place with the particular sweetness that follows a winter spent somewhere you are certain you belong. Ellen planted the window boxes, which she had thought about since June, with marigolds and 2 herbs she had obtained from the Mexican woman who ran the kitchen garden near the church. And the porch in the morning smelled of growing things and morning light and coffee from inside. And Tobias developed the habit of bringing her coffee on the porch before starting his day, which was a small habit with the particular quality of permanence. In March, Ellen discovered she was carrying their first child. She knew before she said anything, sitting with the knowledge for a week and running it through all its implications with the methodical honesty that she brought to everything, and finding that at the end of all the implications, she arrived at a gladness that was uncomplicated and enormous, and a little frightening in the way that enormous things always are. She told Tobias on a Sunday morning on the porch with the coffee, and his face when she told him was the most open she had ever seen it, stripped entirely of anything guarded, just genuine and complete feeling moving through him without restraint. He set down his coffee cup and took both her hands and looked at her for a long moment and then said, "Ellen," in the way he said her name when it was carrying the weight of more than he had ready words for. She squeezed his hands and said, "We are going to need to think about the second bedroom." He laughed, which was a full and real laugh that she had learned to treasure because it was not common, and he said, "I'll start on it this week," and he did. The summer of 1883 moved through with the usual heat and the usual extraordinary light, and the Turner place was busy in all the ways that good places are busy: cattle and fences and water management, and the second bedroom addition, and Patrick learning to shoe horses and Rodrigo coming 3 days a week, and becoming a permanent fixture in all but official designation, and Ellen managing the domestic and financial side of the operation with the same ledger precision she had brought to the boarding house, and with a growing investment in the land itself, that she expressed through the practical work of understanding water rotation and pasture management, which she had been learning by reading and by asking questions. She also maintained her connection with Mrs. Hollies and the boarding house, riding into town twice a week to help with accounts, and to have the kind of conversations with Mrs. Hollies that women who are both practical and warm tend to have, which ranged widely and were nearly always useful. Mrs. Hollies's health had continued to improve through the winter, and in the spring she had taken on a new boarder who was a schoolteacher sent by the territorial government to establish a school in Redrock Flats. And the arrival of a school was a thing the whole town felt good about, and which Ellen felt especially good about because she had been thinking about children and education in the particular way that expectant mothers think about such things. Clarence Holt had not disappeared from Redrock Flats, because men like Clarence Holt did not disappear from small towns simply because they had lost one legal battle. He was still present, still dealing in land speculation, still making the air slightly tighter in rooms he entered. But he had learned, apparently, that Mrs. Hollies was no longer an easy target, and the combination of Daniel Fremont's thorough defeat of the counterclaim and the broader knowledge that the boarding house now had reliable legal counsel meant that Holt's attention had moved to other properties and other prospects. He was a persistent man but not a reckless one, and he calculated his efforts against his expected returns, and the boarding house no longer made his calculation. Ellen was glad of it not because she was afraid of the fight but because Mrs. Hollis deserved to spend her energy on better things than legal battles with small men. The baby came in the early morning of October 14th, 1883, which was a Sunday, which Reverend Marsh would later say was providential in a way that made the congregation smile politely. The birth was attended by Mrs. Hollis, who had experience with such things, and the doctor from Cimarron who made his rounds through Redrock Flats once a month and had been engaged for the purpose. It was a long labor and not an easy one, and Tobias spent the hours of it in a state of controlled anguish that Rodrigo, who was keeping him company in the yard because it was that or let him wear a hole in the front room floor, managed by handing him things to do and being companionably present without trying to fill the time with talk. The baby was a boy. He was large and healthy, and had his father's dark eyes and his mother's particular way of looking directly at whatever was in front of him. Tobias held him in the morning light coming through the bedroom window and looked at him with the expression of a man encountering something so much larger than himself that his only response was absolute stillness. Ellen, tired and certain and complete, looked at the two of them from the bed and felt the kind of peace that is not the absence of difficulty, but is something deeper and more real than that. The presence of everything that matters, held in a morning in October in a house built on red land under an enormous sky. They named him James. James Desmond Turner, the middle name for Ellen's father, which Tobias had suggested without being asked, and which Ellen received as the gift it was. Mrs. Hollis held James for 20 minutes and cried comfortably and said he was the most beautiful child she had seen since Patrick. And Patrick, who came out to the Turner place that afternoon and was permitted to hold his nephew with careful instructions, looked at the small, serious face of James Desmond Turner and said, "Hello, I'm your uncle. I'll teach you to ride," and that was a promise he would keep to the letter. The winter of 1883 was full in a different way than the previous winter, the full of a house that has an infant in it, and all the particular rhythm that imposes, the nighttime feeding and the particular weight of sleeping in shifts, and the way every conversation carries the edge of half attention, because part of you is always listening. Tobias adapted to it with the same methodical steadiness with which he adapted to everything, and he and Ellen fell into a pattern that was both demanding and deeply satisfying, the kind of life that is hard in ways that do not diminish it. Rodrigo's situation resolved itself in the spring of 1884, when he married the woman he had been quietly courting, whose name was Maria Salazar, the daughter of a small-scale farmer who had land south of Redrock Flats along the lower tributary. The wedding was a large and joyful occasion, and the Turners attended with James, who was 6 months old and spent most of the celebration being passed from hand to hand among the Salazar family women, who declared him beautiful and enormous with equal enthusiasm. Rodrigo was deeply happy, which was apparent in the way that a habitually reserved man's happiness is apparent, which is quietly and thoroughly. And Ellen said to Tobias afterward that she had never seen Rodrigo smile that many times in a single day before. Tobias said he was glad for him, and he meant it in the uncomplicated way that generous people mean things. The letter from Samuel Turner came in the summer of 1884, and this time it was not speculative. Samuel's oldest son, whose name was Henry, had turned 17, and Samuel had decided the boy needed country, and he was writing to ask in formal terms whether the offer still stood and what the actual situation with land was in Colfax County. Tobias wrote back with specifics, with acreage costs and water access and the state of the cattle market, and the location of good unclaimed parcels south of the Turner place. And Samuel wrote back that he would send Henry in the fall to see the country for himself, and that if Henry liked it, Samuel might follow in the spring. Henry Turner arrived in October of 1884, which was 1 year after James, and he was 17 and tall, and had the family's brown eyes and a quality of eagerness that was tempered by enough sense to be useful. He looked at the Turner place with the eye of someone who had grown up on working land and knew what he was seeing, and what he saw satisfied him. He spent a week with Tobias and Patrick and Rodrigo, learning the rhythms of the operation, and at the end of the week he told Tobias that he wanted to look at land south of the property, the parcel that was adjacent to the Salazar land, and could they ride it. They rode it on a Saturday, and Henry Turner looked at those acres with the same expression his uncle had used when he first surveyed the Turner place in 1877, which was the expression of someone who has found the right thing, and Tobias recognized the expression because he had worn it himself. Samuel Turner arrived with his wife, whose name was Margaret, in the spring of 1885, and by then Henry had staked his claim and registered it with Harold Fitch and begun building with the particular fevered energy of a 17-year-old who has decided what his life is going to be. Margaret Turner was a small, quick woman with strong opinions and a warm laugh, and she and Ellen liked each other immediately and without negotiation, the way women who are both capable and honest tend to like each other. The arrival of Samuel and Margaret meant that Tobias had family close for the first time since leaving Tennessee, and Ellen watched him with his brother those first weeks and saw the careful way they rebuilt closeness after years of absence, not with grand gestures, but with the gradual resumption of an old language, references to people and places that she did not share but which she was welcomed into as they were explained. She liked Samuel. He was similar to Tobias in his quietness and his reliability, and he was also warmer than Tobias in his laughter, more willing to be openly pleased by things, and she could see the pleasure it gave Tobias to have him nearby. Redrock Flats itself was changing through these years in the ways that territories change when they are becoming something. The school that the schoolteacher had established was now housed in a proper schoolhouse that the town had funded collectively, and it had enough students to justify 2 different instructional sessions, morning and afternoon. The telegraph had expanded its services. A second general store had opened on the cross street. The church had stopped leaning east, which Reverend Marsh attributed to divine intervention and Harold Fitch attributed to a correct application of new timber bracing, and both of them were probably partially right. Clarence Holt, in the manner of a man whose particular ambitions require a certain scale of opportunity, had largely relocated his operations to the county seat in Las Vegas, where there was more money and more land in play. He came through Redrock Flats occasionally, and when he did, the air was still slightly tighter, but he left without incident, and the boarding house and the Turner place existed entirely beyond his interest, and that was the best possible outcome where Clarence Holt was concerned. Mrs. Hollis's health remained generally good, though she was 68 by the spring of 1885, and she had agreed, with Ellen's persistent and affectionate persuasion, to reduce her active management of the boarding house and allow the current longest-staying boarder, a capable woman of 40 named Dorothea Sims, to take on more of the daily running of things. Mrs. Holly still had a full interest in the property and still sat at the kitchen table every morning doing her accounts, but she was no longer carrying feed orders up from the cellar or repairing railings, and she was better for it, and the gleam in her eye that had been there since 1881 had not dimmed. James Turner, at 18 months, was walking with the absolute conviction of someone who has recently discovered that this is possible and intends to use it at every opportunity. He had his father's steadiness and his mother's directness, and he had a particular relationship with the horses that alarmed some people and delighted Tobias, who thought a child who was not afraid of large animals was a child with the right foundation. Patrick had begun teaching James to sit a horse in the spring, which was admittedly early, but which Patrick defended with the argument that 18 months was when he himself had started, a claim that Ellen could not disprove and therefore could not entirely dismiss. In the late summer of 1885, Ellen and Tobias sat on the south porch in the evening after James was asleep and the day's work was done, and the mountains were going dark blue in the last light and the cottonwoods were moving in the warm evening air, and Ellen said, "I want to put the eastern ridge to use." Tobias looked at her. "How do you mean?" She had been thinking about this for several months, and she had it fully worked out in the way she worked things out, carefully and with attention to the actual details. "The ridge has views and it has shelter," she said. "I want to plant an orchard on the eastern slope. Apples and pears, maybe peaches if the water is right. I've been talking to the Salazars and they have a grafted stock they're willing to sell, and I've read about water management techniques that would work for that elevation." He was quiet for a moment, and she knew he was thinking about it seriously, about the soil and the water and the sun exposure, and she let him think. "The soil up there is good," he said finally, "better than the lower pasture for root depth, and you get the afternoon shade from the ridge line in August, which would be important for the fruit." "That's what I thought," she said. He looked at her in the evening light with the quiet steadiness that had been her landmark for 3 years now and said, "We could start with 24 trees in the spring. See how the first season goes before expanding." "That's exactly what I was thinking," she said, and she was smiling. He reached over and took her hand on the arm of the chair, the same careful, precise hold, and they sat together in the warm evening and looked at the land that was theirs and thought about apple trees on the eastern ridge. The orchard went in the spring of 1886, 24 trees planted on the eastern slope of the ridge that was Ellen's in her own name, which was a fact that still gave her a particular satisfaction when she thought about it. She worked the planting herself alongside Tobias and Rodrigo, learning the technique from the Salazar family's knowledge, which was deep and practical and generously shared. The trees were small and hopeful in the red earth, and they required the regular attention of a thing that cannot yet care for itself, and Ellen gave them that attention with the same thoroughness she gave to everything. That spring also brought news from Patrick, who had been quietly spending more and more of his time in Cimarron, which was the nearest large town north of Redrock Flats, and who had been working at a livery stable there that the owner, a man named Beckett, was looking to sell. Patrick had spent 4 years learning horses and saving carefully, and he wrote to Ellen to tell her that he was thinking of making an offer on the Cimarron livery, and could she advise him on the business side of the proposition, and could Tobias possibly look at the contracts. Ellen advised him on the business side, and Tobias looked at the contracts, and both of them told Patrick what they thought with the honesty that was the family currency. And Patrick made his offer, and it was accepted. And at 22 years old, Patrick Keating was a business owner in Cimarron with a livery stable and a reputation for excellent horsework and a quality of happiness that was deeply satisfying to his sister. Ellen wrote to their aunt in Texas to tell her, and the aunt wrote back a long letter that was the longest she had ever written, and which was full of the particular relief of a woman who had been watching over children that were not hers for years and could now feel that she had done her job correctly. James Turner's second birthday in October of 1885 had been celebrated with a small gathering that was really just family, which by that point included Samuel and Margaret, Henry, Rodrigo and Maria, Mrs. Hollies and Patrick, who had come down from Cimarron for the occasion. The gathering around the Turner Place table for that dinner was the most people the house had held, and Ellen had cooked for 3 days in preparation, and Tobias had built a second table extension that he fitted onto the existing kitchen table, and which served so well that it became permanent. Margaret Turner, sitting beside Ellen at that birthday dinner, had said quietly, "This is a good life you've made here, and Ellen had looked at the table and the people around it and the lamp light and the window boxes full of late summer marigolds and said, "Yes, it is," and meant every syllable. In the spring of 1887, Ellen and Tobias's second child arrived. This time it was a daughter, born on an April morning with the cottonwoods in first leaf, and the orchard on the eastern ridge showing its first real growth since planting. They named her Clara for Ellen's mother, and she was small and fierce in the particular way of second children who must make their presence known against the established weight of a firstborn. And James, who was 3.5, looked at his new sister with the grave consideration of someone being asked to share something very large, and then patted her hand carefully and said, "Hello," in the same tone of voice his Uncle Patrick had used at his own birth, which made his father laugh. Clara Keating Turner had her father's brown eyes and her mother's precise disposition, and an opinion on most things within approximately 6 months of arrival. She was also, everyone agreed, very beautiful, and Tobias looked at her with the same expression of absolute stillness that he had brought to James's birth, because some things were large enough that they required the same response each time. The Turner place in the spring of 1887 was a different thing than it had been in 1878 when Tobias had bought it, and a different thing even from what it had been in 1882 when Ellen had first seen it, but it was more itself, which is the best kind of change. The house had 4 rooms now and a proper second bedroom for the children, and the porch on the south side had been extended and had 2 good chairs on it that were occupied on most evenings. The barn had a loft addition. The orchard on the eastern ridge was in its second spring and beginning to show the upward growth that meant the root systems were established and working. The cattle herd had grown to 110 head with careful management, and the cattle market of the late 1880s was reasonably favorable, and the operation was solvent and improving. Rodrigo and Maria had a son, born in 1886, who was named after Rodrigo's father, and who would spend his entire childhood following James Turner around with the devoted devotion of a slightly younger companion. Henry Turner's land to the south was developing well, and Henry himself had in the past year been spending considerable time with a young woman named Alma, the youngest Salazar daughter, which Rodrigo observed with a complicated mixture of professional familiarity and paternal concern that resolved itself into approval when it became clear that Henry was serious and respectful, and Alma was intelligent enough to choose well. Samuel Turner, who had built a smaller house on the southern edge of Henry's parcel, was learning the cattle trade with the same patience he had always applied to the farming trade, and he and Tobias had fallen into the rhythm of 2 brothers who have rediscovered each other in middle life, and are making up for lost time in the particular way that practical people do, which is by working alongside each other and talking while they work, and not always saying the important things directly, but meaning them deeply. On an evening in the summer of 1887, Tobias and Ellen sat on the extended south porch with James asleep inside and Clara in Ellen's arms, and the mountains to the west were doing the thing they did in summer evenings, going from purple to almost black against the last light, and the land below them was going from red to gold to dark in stages. Clara was making the small, satisfied sound of a baby who is full and comfortable, and James had been asked 3 times to go to sleep and had eventually complied on the 3rd asking, and the evening was the particular quiet of a full day in its last hour. Tobias said not to any particular point in the conversation because there was not a particular conversation happening, just as a thing he was thinking. "I used to stand on the eastern ridge before you came, just stand there and look at the country." Ellen looked at the side of his face in the fading light. "I knew I was where I was supposed to be," he said, "but it was the land I was sure about, just the land." He paused. "And then you came. And I stood there with you in July and I thought, it was always supposed to be both things, the land and the person. She looked at him for a long moment with Clara warm in her arms and the whole evening around them. "That is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me," she said, "and you have said some very good things." He turned to look at her, and he smiled, that real complete smile that she had treasured from the beginning, and she smiled back, and Clara made the satisfied sound again, and the mountains went dark, and the stars came up over the Turner place one by one in the enormous clean New Mexico sky. The orchard on the eastern ridge produced its first fruit in the summer of 1889, 3 years after planting, which was the expected timeline, but which still felt like a small miracle when Ellen walked up the slope on a morning in August and found the first small apples hanging on the branches she had planted with her own hands. She stood among the trees for a long time, touching the fruit carefully, and then she went back down to the house and got James, who was 5, and brought him up to see it, and he looked at the apples with the grave consideration he brought to most things and said, "Can I have one?" And she said no, they were not ready yet, and he accepted this with reasonable philosophy. By October the apples were ready, and the whole family harvested them over 2 days, which was a project large enough to require all available hands, meaning the Turners, the Salazars, Samuel and Margaret and Patrick, who came down from Cimarron for the occasion, and worked with the cheerful efficiency of someone who had been told there would be fresh apple pie at the end of it. There were indeed 2 pies and a cobbler, and Mrs. Hollies came out from town for the harvest dinner and sat in the good chair on the south porch and declared the whole thing exactly as it should be. The land was documented. The orchard was producing. The children were growing. The family that had been built on one good piece of land and honesty, and a signed document was complete and solid and deeply rooted, like the apple trees on the eastern ridge, which had spent 3 years sending roots down into the red earth before they showed fruit, because that is how substantial things work, slowly and underground first, and then suddenly, visibly, abundantly in the light. Ellen Turner stood on the eastern ridge in the October afternoon, with the harvest done and the light going golden on the land below, and thought about a carpetbag and $42 and a harvest social, and a table with a bent leg. She thought about Harold Fitch's astonished face across the desk. She thought about he wanted her to have something of her own first, so that any yes she gave later was free. She thought that the best things in a life do not arrive announced. They arrive through the accumulated attention of ordinary days, through the fixing of what is broken, and the giving of what costs something, and the saying of yes to the right things in the October morning, light on a boardwalk in a small territory town. Tobias came up the ridge to find her, as he always did when she was up there longer than he expected, not because he was worried but because he liked to know where she was, and he came and stood beside her and looked at the same view, the mountains and the land and the cottonwoods going gold in the fall, and she leaned against him the way she had on the porch the night they came home from their wedding, and he put his arm around her with the same sureness he brought to everything. And they looked at their country together in the last of the October light. Inside the house below them, James and Clara were with Margaret Turner, who was reading to them from the copy of a story that she had brought from Cimarron on her last visit, and the sound of her reading voice carried faintly up the slope on the still air. The cattle were in the lower pasture, settled for the evening. The apple trees stood in their rows behind the 2 people on the ridge, small and strong and already preparing for spring. Tobias said, "Are you happy?" She turned her head to look at him and she said, "Yes, Tobias. Are you?" He looked at the country below and the sky above and at her face in the October light, and he said, "Yes, completely." And the mountains went dark in stages, and the stars came up one by one, and the Turner place settled into the evening with the deep and practiced contentment of a place that knows what it is and who it belongs to. And nothing about any of it was uncertain, and nothing was left to be resolved, and everything that had been built and planted and given and chosen was exactly where it was supposed to be.